Welcome to the FarrCast, bringing you insights into Wall Street, Washington, and the world. And now here's your host, Michael Farr.
Welcome to the FarrCast. I am Michael Farr. Thanks so much for joining us again this week. It is the 11th day of June, the 11th day of June. Wow, summertime is here in the city of Washington on the East Coast. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I am in the city of Washington this week. Night before last, there were 7 shootings in Washington. Last night, down to only 3 shootings in Washington. I will not be spending a lot of time in Washington this summer. I will be in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. I will be over in Ireland in the middle of July, playing in the Old Head Golf Tournament, and I have a group of friends going over there. I'm really looking forward to that, excited about it. The golf game, ladies and gentlemen, I know you've been on the edge of your seats trying to figure out how Farr's golf game is doing. The answer is okay right now. Okay, the handicap's a 9.2, which is not fabulous, but it feels like it might be coming down. I have a tournament this weekend, and I can use every stroke I can get. On the FarrCast, we cover Wall Street, Washington, and the world. And as I look around, Wall Street markets are just off their all-time highs. Dow Jones Industrial Average just below 39,000. S&P 500, 5360. NASDAQ looked as if it touched an all-time high yesterday, 17,192. Markets are still near their all-time highs. Stocks have gone up this year. 10-year Treasury is at a 442. We got a strong employment number, and then last Friday, strong employment number, which means a couple of things. There are a lot of folks who have jobs. There are not as many people trying to hire anymore. A lot of those positions have been filled. So there's not desperation for employees, which means there's not pressure on wages. They don't have to keep giving raises now. And wage inflation was one of those things the Fed was looking at. And without wage inflation, perhaps the Fed doesn't have to do much anytime soon. That's the big conclusion. Does the Fed have to do anything? No, Wall Street's been praying for the Fed to do something. I haven't, but Wall Street seems to think that that is the fuel for market gains. I think a strong economy and strong earnings are the fuels for market gains, for stock gains. In fact, Peter Lynch said earnings growth is the greatest predictor of stock price performance over time. So you can get a stock that comes out with a great new headline. Hey, this pharmaceutical company just got approved for an early stage trial in an Alzheimer's drug, and the stock shoots up. That doesn't do it, ladies and gentlemen. What does it ultimately is whether the drug gets approved and whether they actually have earnings, So, used to be an old ad on TV for Wall Street about Smith Barney. They had this quasi-British fellow with an affected accent who said, Smith Barney makes money the old-fashioned way. They earn it. Okay, fine. And it worked. It was a very effective ad. They earn it. Well, good for you. They earn it. You do earn it over time. And I think that's really the key. There's so many folks with a gnat-like time and attention span in Wall Street who buy and sell and trade, and it's up and it's down, and the quarterly earnings were ahead by a penny. And oh my God, aren't we excited? No, we're not excited that it was ahead by a penny. And no, we're not excited that it fell off by a penny. No, we don't care. We care that they've got a good balance sheet, a good management team. They care that they've got good products. We care that the pharmaceutical company has drugs that really are effective and that people are buying, and that they've got good profits, and those profits are going to continue to grow over time. That's what we care about. And then we don't want to pay too much for the shares of that particular pharmaceutical company or any other company that's growing in a growing area. That's the other thing. We like to find companies that are growing in growing areas. So if you've got a growing industry, AI, right? Which companies are growing in AI? Well, most damn near all of them. Do any of them really have earnings? Different question. Some do, some don't. Farr likes the one that do. But They're expensive as hell. Everybody wants them. They're expensive as hell. So do they fit FAR's investment discipline? I have to stay disciplined. I can't get emotional. I have to play by the rules because those rules have saved my ass for almost 40 years doing this. Now, as I look at interest rates in the 10-year Treasury right now, that's the cost of money. Cost of money, 10 years is 4.4%. 6 months is 5.3%. The Federal Reserve is meeting right now, and we get their results tomorrow. On this show, we've got Jeff Lacker, former president of the Richmond Federal Reserve Bank, coming up, and we are going to give you the prequel to the Fed's meeting. And next week, Jeff's going to be back. Harry Jennings has arranged for Jeff to be back 2 weeks in a row. Absolutely incredible. Professor Lacker is going to be with us to do the prequel and the sequel. So you can hold us accountable and say, geez, were those two old guys right about what they thought the Fed was going to do and what they needed them to do? We've got Mahaffey coming up this morning. So cost of money, 443. Short term, it's still, you get a really good still return on cash. Over $6 trillion in money market funds, ladies and gentlemen. $6 trillion in money market funds. That's about almost 25% of GDP, of US GDP, is in money market cash. Reserve funds earning 5%. There is an alternative to stocks. Remember when interest rates were like 0.3% on money market funds? Everybody was like, God, this is stupid. I'm earning 0.3%. It's awful on my cash. I might as well buy a stock with a 3% dividend. Well, not so much now, right? You can earn money on your cash. You can earn money on treasury bills. So it has to be a better opportunity than 5% in a money market fund or 5% in a treasury bill. If you see that better opportunity, and you will see it if the market drops, right? If the market drops and the stock prices come down, people will think, oh, well, actually the opportunity got better. Can I really buy these fabulous stocks at a 20% discount? There's cash to do it. So any real drop will be mitigated, will be muted by all of that cash on the sidelines, according to FAR. So I don't see you get big crashes for illiquidity, and you get market bubbles over leverage, okay? And when you get over leveraged and you add a whole lot of debt, markets go way up. You can get to real volatility when that liquidity, when the money supply gets down, when credit gets tight. Credit's somewhat tight right now. They're not lending a whole lot. But people aren't trying to borrow a whole lot. Nobody wants to give up their 3.25% mortgage to go buy a new house and pay a 7% mortgage, right? But think about that for a second. If you're paying 3.25% on a $500,000 loan, your mortgage payment's going to almost double, if you're going to take the same $500,000 loan at twice the interest rate, at 7%. So why would I want to do that? Why would I want to double my payment for the same amount of debt to buy a house that those housing prices haven't come down? There's still a supply problem. There seems to be more buyers still than sellers, and it's not a result of the huge number of buyers. It's the dearth of sellers, and it's the dearth of supply. Okay, oil at 77, fine. The dollar is fine. Gold, $2,300 an ounce, fine. So as we look across the board, as we cover Wall Street, Washington, and the world, Wall Street is fine. Wall Street is fully priced. Wall Street is fully priced. Wall Street is seeing a new revolution, a new version of, we had an industrial revolution, we had a tech revolution and an internet revolution in the late 90s. We now have this artificial intelligence revolution, and it is real, and it's here to stay. And if you haven't signed on ChatGPT to try it and figure out what it does, please do that. Please do that. Your mind will be blown. You won't believe what this stuff can do. You won't believe it. I promise you won't believe it. So we're in the middle of a new revolution. That new technology can continue to go up in the face of a market that's not going up. It's the one area that can work. Also remember that anything that can go up really fast can go down really fast. And anytime you have an emergence of a new type of technology, as we did with the dot-coms, as we did when the automobile was started, there were hundreds of automobile companies. How many do we have now? Half dozen, maybe, when you include the foreign automobile. Those were all domestic, by the way. We didn't have foreign automobile manufacturers at the beginning of the automobile, of course. Now we do, but there are not hundreds. They're not hundreds. And there were hundreds of dot-com companies, and they were winnowed away, and only a few worked. And the number, by the way, is 15%. 15% of the early on adopters will survive as being real companies over time. So 15, maybe go nuts and say 20%. That means 80% aren't going to work. Be very careful out there. Be disciplined. You heard about my discipline when I started today. Please listen to one thing. You have to have a discipline. It has to be dogmatic. It has to be dispassionate. Everything you want to do with your investment program needs to be disciplined, dogmatic, dispassionate, and you'll be okay. You need to achieve your goals. You don't have to beat your brother-in-law. You don't have to beat Wall Street. You have to make sure you have enough money to take care of you and maybe a little bit more to make you really happy. I hope you do it. If I can help you, give me a call. We're going to be right back.
Thank you for joining us this week on the FarrCast. Now it's time for political analyst Dan Mahaffey and your host, Michael Farr.
Welcome back. Thanks so much for being with us. It is the 11th day of June. Mahaffey is back. And as promised, we have Dr. Jeffrey Lacker for segment 3 for a prequel this week and a sequel next week. Will Lacker and Farr get it right about the Fed's decision and what they say? We may or may not get it right. I'm going to tell you right now, we may or may not get it right about exactly what they do. But I will tell you that I think the Federal Reserve would be better off listening to Lacker and Farr than whatever it is they do in those stupid meetings over there a few blocks from my office. But first, I'll see what Lacker thinks of that when he comes on. All right. First, we're going to go to Dan Mahaffey. He is the vice chairman of the Dr. Scholl Foundation with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and the senior political analyst coming to the end of season 6 here on the FarrCast. Welcome back, Dan.
Thank you, Michael. What did I miss while I was gone?
Yes, not a thing.
Not a thing, right? Yeah.
Well, there was a trial in New York. No.
Yeah, well, the only stormy we were worried about were dark and stormies, and our only dot plot was the bug bites. So
I like it.
It's a good time.
Back from the islands looking rested and suntanned, and the rest of us are jealous. But you are a bit young to retire, so we're glad you're back, and we need that brain. Dan, we've had the former president who met with his parole officer yesterday. That sounds like the beginning of a joke, doesn't it?
Yeah,
hey,
yeah.
About the former president's meeting with his parole officer? No, what? I mean, you're just hanging, aren't you? Tell me. I mean, it's a knock, knock.
Yeah, this historical moment here where you have, again, the conviction of a president, the president, though now meeting with his parole officer, how this is handled. Again, most commentators will say, again, a white collar crime likely to have, not a jail time or incarceration type thing. But look, his tenor on this remains irate about it. You hear it in his comments on the judge. Whether this backfires in sentencing remains to be seen. But I think it's also one of those ones, if we talk about those key double haters who are undecided between Trump and Biden, among their sentiment, it would be maybe the former president should just be quiet about this, let the weakness of the DA's case speak for itself as it goes to appellate. And frankly, these people are more turned off, and I think we see some slippage in the polls, but these people are more turned off when he talks about his revenge tour or getting even for this, when they probably think he should just move on, given it's the weakest case against him.
I said this months ago, I think at the end, because we're looking at this potential lineup for the presidential election, for all of the speaking I do around the country and the people I meet, Not one single person in this country has looked up at me and said, "Oh, thank God for Trump Biden. How can you lose with that?" Not one. Not one has said this. Not one. Not one. Most have said, far out of 336 million Americans, we got these two. Really? Really? These are the best we've got. Really? Okay. Dan, let's move on. Hunter Biden's trial, it's gone to the jury. Do we care? Does anybody care? Does this really matter?
I think it does, in the sense of, is the legal system moving fairly one way or another? And I think it's a strong contrast when you have Biden saying, no, I won't pardon him. I'll stay out of this. That's one thing that people see is, look, this is a contrast in one person letting the process play out, and then the other angry at the judge, the jury, the prosecutor, whoever he can yell at.
When I was at CNBC a few weeks ago, I met with management, and they were saying, listen, we've been doing polls and surveys. This presidential election is a hot topic viewers want to hear about now. We normally don't see this until August. This is a hot topic. So this debate on the 27th, I don't know about you, but I can't wait. I mean, I wish, I don't know who they have moderating, but my vote would be Geraldo. Okay. You remember when he opened Capone's vault? I mean, that went on. The buildup was for days. Yeah, well, there was nothing there. There's going to be something here. I think Geraldo, Jerry Springer, God rest his soul, would have been great to moderate this debate.
I'm going to call out to our wrestling fans here. I think we need like Steve Austin or one of them. We need the Undertaker, someone who can really keep these guys in line.
Maybe Mr. T, I pity the fool. Okay, well, maybe
I pity the voter.
Yeah, I pity the voter. I pity him too. Okay, we hear that Secretary Blinken has come up with a proposal that both sides seem to be agreeing to. Are we going to have a peace in Palestine now in Israel?
I'm reluctant to make any predictions given how many hotheads can still derail this on each side, both in Netanyahu's government as well as in Hamas. But you have the UN resolution in place. You have increasing pressure from the other Arab governments to wrap this up. I think you have the more promising signs we've seen in a while. The framework is there to box them in. But again, there's too many players who could derail this at the last moment, in my opinion.
Okay, all of these things have potential impacts on Wall Street as we think about it. War in the Middle East, certainly, and the price of oil and all of these other things. Monsieur le Président Macron has called for a snap new election here after the Conservatives really had a huge win. What does that mean? Keep it tight for Europe here. Tell me what this means. Why is this a big deal? And will Macron lose his job?
A lot of discontent in Europe about the economy and the political circumstances. Take this with a little bit of salt. These are European Parliament elections. Europeans have always used this as sort of a protest vote, relief valve, because again, the European Parliament, while having powers, doesn't have that much power. That said, though, don't underestimate what you see. Again, youth discontent, the rise of nationalism in Europe, all of this coming at a time when transatlantic unity, the future of Europe, all those things are important questions for our election too.
One of our listeners, Dan, I'm going to change the subject to a bit of a philosophical note here before we end. One of our longtime listeners, my friend Regnie Nair, sent me an article this morning by David Brooks that was written last summer, August of 2023, on why America has gotten so mean. And Brooks writes, the most important story about why Americans have become sad and alienated and rude, I believe, is also the simplest. We inhabit a society in which people are no longer trained in how to treat others with kindness and consideration. Our society has become one in which people feel licensed to give their selfishness free rein. The story I'm going to tell is about morals. In a healthy society, a web of institutions, families, schools, religious groups, community organizations, workplaces helps form people into kind and responsible citizens, the sort of people who show up for one another. We live in a society that's terrible at moral formation. Moral formation, as I will use that stuffy sounding term here, comprises three things. This is a great article. He says, in such flawed, self-centered creatures were going to govern themselves. If they were going to govern themselves and be decent neighbors to one another, they were going to need some training. And for roughly 150 years after the founding, Americans were obsessed with moral education. In 1788, Noah Webster wrote, "The virtues of men are of more consequence to society than their abilities. And for this reason, the heart should be cultivated with more assiduity than the head. The heart more than the head." Mm-hmm. I agree with David Brooks. I commend the article to our listeners, David Brooks, August 2023. Dan, as you look at the political landscape and you see what our politicians don't hesitate to say out loud to each other that would have had all of our grandmothers clutching at their pearls, what forecast do you have for what can be accomplished on Capitol Hill? And is any of this healing? And how do we get back to a moral education across not just this? Our education system seems to be failing in terms of where we rank around the world, our kids. But what about the moral education? And why is it no longer a priority?
Well, I think complex problems don't have simple solutions. And what we have is a breakdown of moral education, faith in institutions. Our education system is so focused on teaching to standardized tests and curriculums rather than the development of the whole person. So many of the activities that once brought people together, anything from church groups to the Rotary to the PTA, has either diminished or been subsumed by national politics. And all of this does is put you in your, if you're in your living room watching your political channel of choice and refreshing a social media feed that tells you only what you want to hear, you're not going to grow and understand the viewpoints of other people and how to interact with them. Our kids are suffering from social media. You see it. Youths are shuttled from competitive sport to competitive sport rather than engaging with each other. All of this reflects on our political society. And I don't think you get a near-term answer in this without both where we see more people tuning out from the parties and wanting their own path, but also how do we rebuild our community organizations from the bottom up?
And all I'm thinking about is poor Caitlin Clark, who seems to be conducting herself in a really noble way, the kind of sort of conduct I would be proud to see from my children, as she is seen as a threat to the very institution she is saving and being condemned by those who want more credit and don't want her to have any. My friend, Dr. Harvey Rich, said the difference between jealousy and envy was that jealousy says, I want what you have. And envy was meaner, according to Dr. Rich. Envy says, I not only want what you have, but I don't want you to have it. Envy, he said, that is why envy and not jealousy is one of the 7 deadly
Well,
sins.
we've also totally lost sight of what is compersion, where you aren't jealous, but you actually take joy in seeing others do well. And that's something I think this country has really lost.
Why we can't celebrate each other. The favorite from that article, we got to go, Dan, was from the headmaster of the Stowe School in England, who wrote in 1930 that the purpose of his institution was to turn out young men who were acceptable at a dance and invaluable at a shipwreck. And I love it. Acceptable at a dance and invaluable at a shipwreck. I got to tell you something. I like to think that I am one of those guys. I don't know about invaluable at a shipwreck, but how about damn useful and willing to pick up a shovel or rope or line or row a boat or do whatever is necessary for the well-being of others. And
well, every time I've been with you, you've avoided the shipwreck, which I think is even better.
I get paid to avoid shipwrecks for my clients. I do that. And though it's very awkward, I can even waltz. I had to do that a few years ago. And this friend of my mother's asked me to waltz at this dance where we were. And I thought, oh, crap. but I did it. And I stood up, and it was the Vienna waltz, and here I am waltzing, and Barbara looks at me and she goes, "Oh my God, you can waltz. I can't believe you can." I was like, "Shut up, Barbara. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3." When I started counting out loud, because it was the only way I could waltz. Dan Mahaffey from the Center for the Study of the Presidency, the vice chairman of the Dr. Scholl Foundation. We're going to be right back with Jeff Lacker.
Michael Farr and the FarrCast are proud to support Heroes, Inc. Heroes supports the spouses and children of law enforcement officers and firefighters who gave their lives in the line of duty to the greater Washington, D.C. community. Their singular goal is to honor the supreme sacrifice made by these individuals by caring for their families. Heroes' work begins within 24 hours of the tragic loss and continues indefinitely. We invite you to learn more about Heroes' mission at heroes.org. We hope that you will consider supporting Heroes as they endeavor to honor those who protect us. That's heroes.org. Heroes, here for you, here for good. And now, back to the FarrCast and your host, Michael Farr. We appreciate you listening into the FarrCast this week. And now to introduce this week's special guest, here's your host, Michael Farr.
Welcome back to the FarrCast. As promised, I know you're on the edges of your various seats. Dr. Jeffrey Lacker, former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, professor of all things brilliant and economic at several different universities. The resume even embarrasses him when I read it out loud. So I'll stop, but I will add my great friend for a lot of years. Welcome back, Jeff.
Great to be here with you, my friend Michael.
You're wonderful. You're wonderful. We always learn so much, and we hear from our listeners. We added over 1,000 listeners last quarter. We're really? Doing great. Oh yeah, we're hot, baby. We're hot. Good. Okay, FarrCast. Who knew that business chat could be hot? Well, we're hot. Okay, Jeff, the Fed's getting ready to have their big meeting. We had this funny kind of employment number. But from sort of all the telltale signs, inflation seems to be growing at a bit more modest pace, trending in the right direction. The economy continues to expand, though the Atlanta Fed has just slashed their numbers for GDP growth. The consumer appears to be running out of wallet, and stock market's near all-time highs. Are we whistling past the graveyard? Is the Fed sitting on their hands too long? What's going on?
So the dominant feature of the incoming data over the last several months has been the rise of inflation, as you noted. Last month was 3.1% at an annual rate by their favorite measure. This is for April. But to put that in perspective, in the last 6 months of 2023, that inflation measure ran 2.1%. And that's what got everybody hyped up at the end of last year, including the FOMC, about the prospect for rate cuts this year. The first 4 months of this year to date, inflation has run 4.1%, even with that 3.1% April number. So I think 3.1% is a welcome decline from 4.1, but I think it's too soon to say we're on a decided downtrend in the rate of inflation because you've got wage rates going up at rates that are inconsistent with 2% inflation. And until you get the services sector, which tend to be dominated, where costs are dominated by wage, until you get service sector inflation to settle down more, you're not going to be able to declare victory and start cutting rates.
The JOLTS number has come back down to basically the pre-pandemic level. That JOLTS number, ladies and gentlemen, is job openings, basically job openings versus folks who are claiming to be unemployed and looking for work. So it was well over 2 to 1. We're now back to those normal kind of levels. We've seen an increase in the labor force participation rate. More people have come back into the workforce. These are usually signs that wage inflation should begin to moderate here, that the pressure for wage inflation should be going away, but for other inflation and input costs. Yes or no?
Generally, that's right. It's a sound economic principle, I think, of macroeconomics.
Yeah, I found one. How about that? Farr found one. Lacker agrees with Farr. Thank you so much, Dr. Lacker, for appearing on the FarrCast. Oh, sorry. I just figured I should get an old salesman just leaves. Once the customer says yes, you get the hell out the door. I just got what Lacker said I was right about something, folks. I should leave. Okay. Sorry.
There's no doubt that there's signs of gradual cooling in the labor market and economic activity more broadly, but it's around the edges and it's sort of minor in the grand scheme of things. Whether that cools off inflation or not remains to be seen. But I think the lesson of the first half of this year, first half of the year we've been through for the Fed, is that their policy rate of 5.3% on the federal funds rate is likely to be not as sufficiently restrictive as they thought, if I could mince words a bit.
Okay, so now that was a very hawkish remark that Dr. Lacker just made. Now, Dr. Lacker is known to historically be hawkish. Boy, I think I just butchered the grammar on that one. Okay, but we'll parse it. We'll parse it later. Okay, it has not been sufficiently constrained. What'd you say?
Right.
That okay?
Right.
So will the real rate? And I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, but as inflation comes down, the gap between the 5.25% Fed fund rate and inflation gets bigger. That becomes more. So inflation at 4% versus inflation at 3% means that you have a higher real rate being charged on money. So if this inflation continues to come down, could it prove sufficient if the trend continues lower, Dr. Lacker?
So there's a chicken and egg thing going here, right? I mean, if it's not sufficiently restrictive now, is inflation going to come down enough to make it restrictive? And that's kind of what the Fed's been gambling on for a year now. A year ago, they basically decided 5.3 was about enough, was going to be enough, but they weren't sure. And the data in the second half of last year made it look like it was a good bet. Now it looks like it's not clear it's a good bet. Inflation 2% last half of last year, 4% first part of the year. Looking forward, they're unclear and they're going to stand pat until they know more. And when I say stand pat, I think they're standing pat through the end of the year. I don't think they're going to.
So do I. And I think if they don't, I think they should.
Well, here's a good way to think about that argument, and here's a strong case. So they had 6 months of 2% inflation. It proved to be a bit of a fake out. They've got 4 months of bad inflation numbers. How many months of good inflation numbers would it take to make them more confident than they were in December, that they were back approaching 2%? So there's only what, like 6 data releases, inflation releases between now and December. And so if they get another half year, well, and it's good numbers. Well, that's great. But you had 6 months last year and you waited. So they're going to have to wait to be sure that this blip in the first half of this year is gone away and isn't going to come back again.
You've been in this particular position a lot of the time since we've known one another, which is a long time now, where you've had this very clear view, and yet the Fed, and when you were a voting member on the FOMC, they would often take a more benign view of inflation and conditions than you've had. Okay, so we're clear on what you think. What do you think they're going to do? And what do you think that conversation is in those meetings today and tomorrow? And basically, isn't tomorrow about how they're going to present and today's more about what they're going to do?
Yeah, so today they're going to review the economic outlook. There'll be a report from the desk on financial market conditions, but that's not that big a deal. This meeting, they'll get a presentation on all of their submissions to the summary of economic projections. They'll get to see what all their colleagues put in for how many rate cuts are going to happen this year.
They get to see their own dot plot. Yeah.
Yeah, and they get to revise it if they want.
Okay.
So you can revise them after.
Does that happen? Does that happen often? Do people revise it when they see everybody else's?
It does not a lot sometimes, but not a lot.
Okay.
Usually what everyone else is going to do is pretty predictable. So the speculation is the median dot will be 1 cut this year. I think that's probably a reasonable prospect. It might be 0. I kind of doubt it. It might be 2. That's plausible. But it's going to be less than 3. The median plot was 3, but it was just barely, like one person over the line from 2 to 3 cuts last time. The thing I'm going to be looking at is longer run projections. Okay. And that inched up in March. From December to March, that inched up. 8 participants raised their estimate of the long run neutral rate. And I expect that to continue again. And that really reflects a change in their understanding of what sufficiently restrictive is. That passes through 1 for 1, because the higher the neutral rate, the less restrictive the current rate is.
So, Jeff, this meeting, they do nothing. This meeting, Powell comes out and says, we're still data dependent, and we're taking a look at, recent data, the 2% data, the 3% data, and we're watching this thing evolve, and we think that there is sufficient evidence to be patient. That's what he's going to say?
Yeah. He's going to emphasize holding firm for a while. He wants people to back out rate cuts. He's going to be baited by the media staff. They're kindly and gently and politely and respectfully baited to go out on a limb about the possibility of rate increases. He's not going to go for the bait. He's going to stick with, we're not talking about that yet. So he's going to stick to that message.
You sound like you think the Fed is basically doing the right thing here, but it sounds like you don't think they're in the position of getting ready to make any big mistake. The thing that worries me is when he somehow inadvertently gives them the catnip that they want, and all of a sudden you see stocks shoot up in the middle of that conference, and all I think is, no, they didn't listen. They heard it the way they wanted to hear it. They didn't hear it the way he said it. But that's the big danger of these press conferences, I think, for the chairman. He's gotten better at them. But do you worry about that the way I worry about it?
So he has a tendency to convey a message that's slightly more dovish than the statement itself that's released at 2, a half hour before the press conference. And so the history is, whatever the statement does to markets kind of rise on what he says. What I think comes out is that they have been, certainly earlier this year, certainly were seemingly itchy to cut rates if there was a rationale for it, if there was an open door to that. And I think the signaling of rate cuts this year contributed to the froth and the firmness of inflation earlier this year. And so I think he's going to be trying to pulling back on rate cut expectations. But the thing I would critique about his performance is that the Fed doesn't do enough to convey to markets that the Fed isn't sure exactly what's going to happen at the end of the year. Data is going to come in. It could be this way, it could be that way. If it comes in this way, they do this. If it comes in that way, they do that. And I think that sense that future actions are contingent on future data is something that they haven't succeeded in conveying to markets. I know they understand it very well, but I don't think markets absorb that as well as they could.
Professor Dr. Jeffrey Lacker, past president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, Virginia, and a former voting member of the Federal Open Market Committee. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Michael. Take care and be well.
That's it for another FarrCast, folks, as we cover Wall Street, Washington, and the world, bringing you insiders to help us better understand the world in which we live and make better investment decisions and think more. I hope you listen to me in segment 1 about being dispassionate, dogmatic, and disciplined as you approach your investments. Emotion will bring you down every time. For our producer, Harry Jennings, everybody at Hightower Advisors, Farr Miller in Washington, thanks so much for being with us. I'm Michael Farr. See you next week.
Thanks for joining us this week on the FarrCast with our preview of the Fed's big decision. And thanks to our guest, Dan Mahaffey, and former president of the Richmond Federal Reserve Bank, Dr. Jeffrey Lacker. Join us next week when we will review the FOMC statement, Jay Powell's remarks, and market reaction. Kenny Polcari is scheduled to be with us on the markets. Dr. Lacker will join us to analyze what we got right, what we got wrong, and how Powell is navigating the evolving economic landscape. The FarrCast is produced by Michael Farr and Harry Jennings and comes to you weekly for free on all major podcast platforms, including Spotify, TuneIn, and Apple Podcasts. You can stream past episodes as well as subscribe so you never miss a new one. Please be aware that anytime we or any of our guests mention a specific company sector or refer to performance in relation to an earnings report, news headline, or economic trend, it is not a recommendation to buy or sell. Review the risks and rewards of any investment with your financial advisor for what specific investment and general strategy is appropriate for you before you make any investment decision. And as always, if we can be of assistance at Farr Miller in Washington, please reach out to me at hjennings@farrmiller.com. We are here to help, and I'm happy to arrange for any of our listeners an appointment with one of our financial professionals to review your portfolio, your needs, and your goals. We love reading all of your notes and try to reply to as many as we can. You can reach us at hjennings@farrmiller.com. Let us know any questions you have about past episodes or questions you'd like us to address in upcoming shows. Take care, stay safe, and stay healthy. Join us next week. Thanks for listening to the FarrCast. Wall Street, Washington, and the world. Farr Miller in Washington is a group comprised of investment professionals registered with Hightower Advisors, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Some investment professionals may also be registered with Hightower Securities, LLC, member FINRA and SIPC. Advisory services are offered through Hightower Advisors, LLC. Securities are offered through Hightower Securities, LLC. All information referenced herein is from sources believed to be reliable. Farr Miller in Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC have not independently verified the accuracy or completeness of the information contained in this podcast. Farr Miller in Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC, and any of its affiliates make no representations or warranties, expressed or implied, as to the accuracy or completeness of the information or for statements or errors or omissions or results obtained from the use of this information. Farr Miller in Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC, and any of its affiliates assume no liability for any action made or taken in reliance on or relating in any way to the information. This podcast and the materials contained herein were created for informational purposes only. The opinions expressed are solely those of the authors and do not represent those of Hightower Advisors, LLC, or any of its affiliates. Farr Miller in Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC, or any of its affiliates do not provide tax or legal advice. This material was not intended or written to be used or presented in any way to any entity as tax or legal advice. Clients are urged to consult their tax and/or legal advisors for related questions.